In a world where systems often fail to support people effectively, it takes an innovative mindset to navigate the challenges and uncover solutions. Our lived experience can lead to positive change, guiding us to find new ways to help others to thrive. I invite you to join me on an extraordinary journey of discovery with our guest, Joy Carol Young, a beacon of inspiration whose wisdom will help you meet people where they are. In this episode, we will learn how each of us can transform lives by fostering an environment of acceptance and understanding. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited for you to join me today as we talk about how more people are continuing to break barriers to autism inclusion and advance neurodiversity in education and the workplace. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Joy Young. She's a constantly curious neurodiversity advisor and advocate who was named one of the top 50 global neurodiversity evangelists this year. She's over 30 years of working as a neurodiversity coach, an educator, and a school leader, and has played key roles in the development of neurodiversity centers of excellence at places like Ernst & Young. Today, she's here and she joins me, and we're going to share our journeys and her experiences at work and in life, and how she's informing new ways of working, more so to promote neurodiversity and create more opportunities for inclusion at work. So welcome, Joy. We are just so glad to have you here today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I am just so very excited to be having this conversation with you and with our listeners. I think it is on the hearts and minds of many individuals, and so I hope that I can be of a little help.
I just really want to start from our connection point. As much as your story is like my own, you've merged your experience as an autism mom, a neurodivergent mom, and a parent advocate with your professional experience. I'd really like for you to share with our listeners why autism inclusion and neurodiversity are just so important for you.
Let me just kind of back up and do the cliff notes. I grew up in a Midwestern family that moved to California. I was exposed to life in many different facets and loved living, went to college, got married, and things were my dream until we discovered that having children was going to be difficult. Over a 4-year period, we had 24 failed adoptions. And then finally, the love of our lives, a little 4-year-old boy, came into our hearts and our home. At that point, I thought it would be smooth sailing until I learned, and this was in 1996, that our son had what Emory University told us was autism. My husband was a psychologist. I was an educator. We had seen a TV special on autism in Romania, but we knew nothing more. This began a journey that was unexpected, but truly has been the richest aspects of our lives, as we have learned that there are many different ways of thinking, each one of them valuable, each one of them necessary to have a full and rich life.
And so I remember, and I'd love for you to share a part of your story of the moment where it wasn't just that you realized your son was autistic, but that he also had these exceptional abilities. So often when we think about autism, especially as parents at the beginning, it's everything they cannot do. But you and your husband had a view of these amazing things that your son could do. Could you tell us more about that and how that helps start reshaping your thinking about like the power of possibility?
When Sean was diagnosed, it was because he was not presenting socially in his public school classroom as the rest of the students. His first grade report card said, Sean should pay more attention. When we asked Sean what that comment meant, he said, Mom, I've got straight A's. What does she mean? And the fact of the matter was, his teacher was concerned that he was not making eye contact. That proceeded through the public school with little things like he won't keep his hands off the walls. Sean loved touching the crevice in the cinder blocks that was smooth as he walked down the hallways. It brought him a soothing sensation and grounded him to stay in the line that the teacher required they be in. Sean was disciplined because he wouldn't keep his hands off the wall. We began to have more and more of these situations, and at the same time, Sean is in the gifted program. He's very bright. He is excelling intellectually, but these behaviors are causing concern amongst the staff. Now, please understand at this point that I am a public school administrator in a neighboring school. So I'm coming in for these conferences as any parent with anxiety about, okay, what did he do right? What do we need to work on? In the end, when Sean got ready to go to middle school, the IEP meeting, at this point we had an IEP, the IEP meeting suggested that we needed to do a certain list of things, and here's what they would be working on. And the teacher in that meeting and the administrator said, we've never had an autistic student before. My husband kicked me under the table. I knew that meant something. When we got home that night, he said, we've got to regroup. We're not going to have our son be the first. We chose a small private school where they were very loving. They interviewed Sean. We thought, okay, he'll get more attention in this. Long story short, the first 6 weeks were crash and burn. Also, I had left my public school administrative job to take a teaching position in the school to help to pay for tuition. We had moved our daughter out of her public school to come to this private school, and now it wasn't working. Fast forward, long story short, we asked Sean, what kind of an educational setting do you need to do your best? Sean was failing 6th grade math. He said, Mom, I've been doing long division since I was in 2nd grade. My husband said, I guess everything Sean said means you need to homeschool him. Now, yesterday was my 42nd wedding anniversary. It is a wonder after that statement that I am still married. But it started us on a homeschool journey. We pulled Sean out of the private school. We started homeschooling, and that's another wonderful conversation that you and I have had, and it opens up so many possibilities, not for everyone. But Sean didn't need to be doing long division because he was in calculus at a mathematics level. No wonder he was failing 6th grade math. So all of that brought us to a new place of being innovative, creative, and understanding that while Sean had these sensory social challenges, he had an incredibly talented, innovative, creative way of thinking, and we needed to tap into that strength and not be concerned about him being, quote, quote, well-rounded.
And so that was that breaking point. And I think it's interesting that you shared that autism was new for you. Your husband's a psychologist, you're an educator, but in 1996, and I've shared this with folks, autism wasn't widely known. Most people didn't know somebody with autism. We fast forward to today. I don't know if I can walk down the street and not meet a new person and they're somehow impacted by somebody with autism. So obviously, like myself, you and I, our first efforts were really to support our own children. How do we educate them to the best of their abilities with systems that just aren't designed to support them and their unique attributes and their differences? But you segued that, right? So you went from supporting your son, these amazing education opportunities. He went to college early, like my children are. And while that's a very specific path, at some point, you've also segued to see that there are other children and adults that are just like him. And you started helping other educators and businesses to do that. When did that start? And when did you come to the realization that this need was bigger than just your unique story?
So every experience that I had with Sean, every lesson that I learned, I took that back into the public school. I returned to the public school. I took that into the public school and began to apply it as a teacher, as an administrator, in situations that just didn't seem quite right. And I'll use this again, but my tagline is, what am I missing? A student would come to my office because the teacher said they didn't. They would sit there, have a quiet moment of decompressing, and then I thought to myself, I'm missing something. Every child I know desires and wants to do their best. I know all the things they didn't do. Let's go back and see what they did do. And so they would share a story with me, Mrs. Young. And so they would share with me what was right. We would affirm the strengths. And I think, Theresa, that's one of the things that you and I have talked about. What are the strengths of the individual? The focus on that. I would find out what they did right. I would understand that there was a sensory intervention, a distraction, a bully in the classroom, a communication confusion between them and the teacher. We would sort all that out. We would meet with the teacher, provide the explanation, and then we would keep on rolling. So Sean taught me to stop and ask, what am I missing? That aspect of strength is so important. And I think back unknowingly, when Sean first came to us, he was 4, and he loved to fiddle with things. So I started bringing home things like old typewriters, old tape recorders, answering machines. Remember those? And I gave him a screwdriver, a pair of pliers, and he would start taking them all apart to see how they worked. That was how his mind worked. We did that unknowingly when he was 5, 6, and 7. But that was his strength, to ask questions that then brought him into the world of coding, that got him to Georgia Tech, that helped him solve problems in coursework that no one else could solve because that inquisitive mind craved that. We had to have homeschool to get through some of his English courses, some of his Latin work, some of his required well-rounded curriculum that he would probably have failed in another setting because he's not good at everything. He is not well-rounded. He has specific gifts and talents, and that is what fuels and provides his life and his purpose today.
And as I hear about this well-rounded student, and as the listeners are thinking, they're probably thinking, well, that makes sense for education. You know, our systems are designed so that you get this well-rounded education. But then I segue to the workplace. And when I think about it, that's what we do for employees too. You and I know that if we focus on strengths and accentuate those areas, and I don't want to say diminish, but kind of leave behind the areas that aren't the strengths, because that's probably somebody else's strengths, so they can counterbalance each other. When we look at the workplace, we kind of have the same model. Whether you're a coder or an accountant or a lawyer, it doesn't matter. There's still this idea that you have to still be like good at presenting and good at networking and good at scheduling your time and managing tasks. And then when we think about autism and the deficits with communication and presentation and executive functioning skills, and this strengths-based view that we've learned from educating students and finding the best ways to support them. And we think about Howard Gardner's work, and we think about Temple Grandin's focus on different types of thinkers. And then you segue to the workplace, and it's like education all over again. We have these lump sum jobs, and it just perpetuates itself. So you have a lot of experience in this space as well, where you start to work with employers or these individuals that are trying to, they've received educations, right? Whether their parents, like us, chose homeschool, college, or they found the right people within the public school, and now they're ready to work, and now they've got this next barrier. What do you see as that primary barrier? Is it really this expectation of be all things, or is it something else?
So to go back and answer your previous question as to how I got there in this corporate and business setting, and I apologize, I began to have students come back to me after high school graduation. At this point, I'm a special ed high school principal. My entire high school was special ed students, private, lots of resources. And I used to say to the students, just hang in there. If we can get you through high school and all these required courses, it's going to get better. They would go off to college. They would get a degree. They would then attempt to get work, or they would get work and get fired. They came back and said, Mrs. Young, these people don't get me. They don't understand what I need. Please help. I was introduced to some people at Ernst & Young who had started a program, the Neurodiversity Centers of Excellence, where they had hired managers to strategically support individuals with specific gifts and talents that weren't all things to all people. They might struggle with starting a day at 8 o'clock. They might need a separate, quiet place to work instead of an open environment. They might benefit from an agenda handed to them prior to the meeting so they could take notes. And this wonderful group at EY intentionally created spaces where individual needs could be met in a flexible format to bring out the best, identifying how each individual worked best. And I think that's what I have seen in the last 7 years in this movement, as it were, this neurodiversity movement, is that flexibility, and it's moving away from some of the traditional, but we've always done it this way. And I will tell your listeners this because I have said this to many people at Ernst & Young. When I was first told this existed, I seriously doubted that it could be real, because I contended, from what little I knew about EY, that EY and neurodiversity were oxymorons, that there was no way that these two concepts could work together, because in my preconceived mind, EY was in New York. It was starched white shirts with ties. It was clock in from 8 to 5. It was social events in the evening. It was rigid and productive and fast-paced and successful. Now, successful EY is, but as I came into this community of very committed people to supporting talent that is 20% of our population, it was wonderfully heartwarming to know that people were trying. Did they always get it right? No. But what I love is the growth mindset in this organization and in many others. And I do want to acknowledge I've had the privilege to work with many other groups as well. I wanted to just kind of give your listeners a clue as to what some of these organizations are. Everything from IBM, Microsoft, Bank of America, Ford Motor, Comcast, Walgreens, Dell, Auticon, Freddie Mac, Georgia Tech, Vanderbilt, Goldman Sachs. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, that in 2023, we're acknowledging that there's an incredible group of individuals that have value and purpose and simply need some adjustments.
And what I love about those organizations that some folks may not know is they're a consortium. So they all come together, and actually many of them were part of my research at the very beginning. Some of them started about 2012, 2015. And one of the things they did that I think is really critical for other businesses that are like, I want to do this too, is that you really do need to start small and very hyper-focused, looking at a work group and a management function that seems to be willing to be flexible, to start thinking not just about accepting differences in behavior, but really to start thinking differently about how they work together too, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I have learned over time is, number one, you need a leader in that organization that will champion this, because it does look different. And so many organizations are concerned about the look or the fact of, well, can we do this? there's a whole conversation about legalities in this. And I love the organizations that have chosen to look at universal design, which to the best of my knowledge, all of these groups have, is that instead of us going through and spending money on a person in our organization that is the accommodations person, and that we fill out links of forms, we go and get doctor's reports, which may be costly to the individual. We then go through a committee to decide whether or not this is appropriate. Can we do this for you or can we not? And we spend all of our times and energies and resources on that. The leader has the power to begin to have conversations with neurodistinct talent in the organization to say, what would be good for all of us? And I love that about so many organizations. And so they're not accommodating an individual with autism or ADHD or dyslexia. They are actually simply adjusting the way they think. They're having a growth mindset, and they are finding that what was good for that individual, for example, the agenda ahead of time for the meeting, or the option to have your camera on or camera off for the meeting, that maybe that doesn't have to be an accommodation for one person. Wow, that's actually an adjustment that we can make for our entire organization.
Right. And then that's where that concept of accessibility comes in. That access means it's at the ready. A lot of times I think leaders really miss the point when they think from an accommodations mindset, because if we go to like mobility disabilities, today it's like, well, if you show up and need an accommodation, let us know and we'll try to, help you. But if somebody showed up in a wheelchair and you didn't already have lifts and ramps, that would be quite an undertaking to accommodate that individual. So I think that some businesses run into that trap where when they think, how are we going to accommodate all these individuals? Because they don't think bigger, like, what are some of these accommodations that really could be scaled to benefit the whole? And like you said, more businesses are starting to think about, why couldn't this be part of how we do business here?
Absolutely. And while we're on this topic, if I can, I've made kind of my short list of universal design adjustments. And again, I just love that term that I'd like to share with you, if I might.
Absolutely.
So, clear, concise, specific instructions. That is very beneficial for an autistic mind, but beneficial to everybody. Written instructions in addition to verbal instructions. The teacher in me loves that. Flexible working hours. If I really hit my stride at 11 o'clock, your organization might need me to come in at 9 o'clock, but could we consider that flexibility for everyone? And at this point, I do want to say each organization needs to decide how to deliver this. If you are open to customers from 8 to 4, you're going to need your employees to come in. But if you are working remotely, working on advertising, coding, spreadsheets, could you start your day at 9 or 10 o'clock? Those are questions organizations need to ask.
And Joy, I'd like to add there, when it comes to flexibility, another way to think about it isn't just the hours, but like the start and stop hours, but giving folks flexibility in how they control their day. Because like some companies may have meetings first thing in the morning and they have a schedule. And for some of your folks, maybe meetings would be better in the afternoon. So like working with your people where they are. And I think that's another way to view flexibility of working. Like, are you allowing them to control how they schedule the work, even if they can't always control the time spans?
Absolutely. And will this be a discussion? Yes. My son is currently fully remote. His organization is on East Coast time. We're Central time. They have stand-up meetings 3 times a week. He has to adjust himself to make sure that he's at those meetings. But then after that, he has a very flexible schedule. He has energy peaks and troughs. And so he's able to adjust accordingly. And consequently, it's how he works best, and they get the very best from him as a contributor because he has that opportunity. But again, I want to respect that not every person fits in the needs of every organization. And part of this has to be negotiated. And there are some situations where it just doesn't work. The employee has to understand that. At the same time, part of this is the stretch for a traditional organization that's always done it a certain way.
Right. And I think some folks, when you and I talk to folks and we say things like, you need to have more clear and concise communications and allow flexibility of structures and communicate differently. Most people, when we have that first conversation, most people agree. But then when you really start to peel the onion back or maybe talk to their employees, they may find they're not as clear as they think they are. Their meetings aren't as organized. They don't clearly articulate tasks. They don't have the pilot checklist, as Temple Grandin would say, right? And so when you miss some of these things, they're not hard changes, but it's things that you just want to be really aware of. Where's my blind spot in terms of how I'm leading my team? And I know in my research, and I think you found this too, these changes don't just benefit the inclusion of more autistic and neurodivergent individuals. We find a lot better productivity and employee engagement on the typical side too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're back to the topic of communication.
Yes.
Which really is what this is all about, whether we're communicating with a person that identifies as neurodivergent, whether we're communicating with someone who identifies or just feels that they're just neurotypical, or the person that doesn't kind of know where they fit. Communication takes work. And that's back to the question of what might we consider for a person to be their best selves and to bring their energies and talents into a working environment that would consider flexibility. Things like a walking meeting. There's great research on showing that neurological firings happen when we walk, especially in nature. So can we get away from our computers and our seats and go out and walk down the hallway, or if you have a garden in your office area, go and walk and talk and not be forced to make eye contact. That's extremely draining for a number of autistic individuals to stare into the eyes of another person. If I'm walking side by side, my mind is free and the stress is relieved, and I'm coming up with all kinds of solutions that I might never have come up with if we weren't walking. Things like quiet workspaces, places without distractions, access to coaches. This is one of the places I just really want to applaud EY. They invested, and that was my role there, was an internal neurodiversity coach for not only the talent and the employees in this group, but also for the managers.
Okay.
But that internal role was like a jump start to me, in that when I had conversations with individuals, I understood the EY environment. I understood where the barriers were. I understood some of the non-negotiables that they had to deal with. Had I been an external coach, it would have taken me weeks to ramp up to understand what the needs of that person were. As an internal coach, available to those that requested and needed, I was able and feel very successful in my role that we were able to retain and provide meaningful employment and a contribution to this organization that most likely would not have happened had my role not existed. And so an organization needs to begin to ask the question, what was my salary? In contrast, potentially there were 8, 10, 12 people that stayed with the firm that might have left or might have been asked to leave had I not been there. So that access to a knowledgeable coach internally is tremendously important to me. Simple things like fidgets. We all move and shift, but is it okay for me to sit and use a spinner while we're talking? It helps my brain work. Again, if I have my camera off, you don't know or care. But does it look professional? I think those are some of the things that we're moving away from, is those appearances and understandings. Focus on the task rather than hours spent. Now, in some organizations, and I loved having been at EY because I understood that time that, contract with the person that you were going to deliver to, and that you had a restriction. But there are many jobs, and autistic people thrive in this. It may take me longer. My brain may buffer. This is what my son says: Mom, I just need a chance for my brain to buffer, and then I'll answer you. That time is a flexible aspect that some organizations can offer an individual. And so instead of worrying about 8 hours, are you more concerned about the quality of the task than you are about how long it took them?
It's that processing speed they talk about a lot, where a lot of extroverted folks, which we are an extroverted society right now, are very quick to respond. But sometimes we don't even appreciate that those quick responses often lack data, thought, and they tend to be generalized. And that slower processing speed, which may seem like it's burning a clock, will usually come with richer data and more thoughtful responses. And there's a value to that. And I think for some companies, they need to really be able to understand that there's a balance and that you want both.
Absolutely. And if I can offer you a story on that one, when I first joined EY, we had an individual that, and I will never use names, so I'm going to change up his name, and I'm going to call him Anders. And so Anders was struggling on his team. And yet I knew in working with Anders that he was very intelligent, came from an Ivy League school, took 5 years to get through college instead of 4, but that was okay, because had insights and understandings of situations that no one else did. So on his team, he would be asked a question on a Zoom call. This is as we've gone, with COVID, and we're doing everything on calls now. He was required to have his camera on. He'd be asked a question, and he would just freeze. Partial anxiety, but partial need to hear, to consider the alternative, to think about the myriad of variables that he felt he needed to consider before he offered a solution. And the manager on that particular project just didn't feel like he was engaged. So I asked the question, as I did as a principal in my office with the student who'd gotten thrown out of class: what am I missing? As an organization, what are we missing? Worked with an incredible manager to say, okay, well, let's consider these things. In my coaching, determined that, number one, having screen off would be helpful, but even at that, responding verbally was challenging to get the right words under pressure, under time, because it's a 30-minute call, right? Clock's ticking. We've all got other meetings to get to. So I asked, would the team consider allowing the individual to do a couple things? Number one, if there was a response that Anders could give at the time, could Anders put that in the chat? Would that be okay? Well, yeah, I don't see a problem with that. Anders is really good at typing, so we tried that. Then in situations where Anders couldn't give an immediate response, Anders would type, thinking, I'll get back. 30 minutes after the call, Anders would go in and put that piece of brilliance in the chat, having typed it, available to everybody. What began to happen is other people said, do I have to talk out loud? Could I just put my thoughts in the chat? And the whole team shifted to this communication style that had a recording of what was said. There it was. I can go back, I can reflect on it, I can think of it. And this became an adjustment that many teams took advantage of. Anders then thrived, got promoted, and we had a very successful experience simply because of the way we communicated and the fact that there wasn't just one way to do something.
And I think that's an interesting point, because you're talking about a very different way of communicating in terms of allowing time, processing, allowing responses in writing or verbal ways. And the reason why I'm jumping on this is because there's a whole generation of leaders that took communication styles and leadership styles. And one of the things that they're taught isn't just that there's different ways that people think and talk and process information, but that training back in the day, if you recall, talked about how you modify yourself to meet people where they are. And while I think you and I would both agree there is some truth to MBTI and understanding how people process, what you and I are saying is not learn other people's styles so that you can adopt their styles, which is what we used to teach leaders, but rather learn other people's styles so you can meet them where they are, which is a very different message and a different way of working. And I think we have a whole generation of leaders that were taught, like Ernst & Young, wear your white shirt, your tie, you have a directive manager, this is how you communicate with that person. And now we're saying, you are who you are, your manager's different, how can you meet in the middle?
Absolutely, absolutely. And to be very relevant with this, yesterday on LinkedIn, and I love the people, and that's how we connected, and I love the connections with LinkedIn. I got triggered. I'll use that word. I got triggered by a post from a photographer. Now, this is interesting that this hit me this way, but the reason I got into this space truly was because I went to a conference and I heard the speaker say, find something that breaks your heart and go do something about it. And as individuals would come back to me, my students, as I would have people in the community come and tell me stories, as I watched my own son be misinterpreted and be wounded and completely misunderstood, it kept breaking my heart that I knew that was not that person's intent. That was not the message that was communicated. Y'all got this wrong. And I truly long to come into community and help our world understand that there's another way. We're missing something. We've got to look at this differently. So on this LinkedIn post yesterday, photographers were sharing and giving pictures and lots of accolades. And they talked about a particular approach where the person was gazing off into the distance, that wasn't real professional, and that the person had been sent back to get another picture made where they were looking directly into the camera and looking through their eyes. And then all of these statements started coming because the eyes are the windows to the soul. And because you can tell if a person's being honest or not by whether they look directly at you. And then all of these myths, these traditional beliefs that we've had, that we've been told from our grandparents and our parents, look them in the eye. I know because my son can't, not that he won't, but neurologically, it causes him physical pain to look you for any length of period straight in the eyes. I knew that group of photographers, as so many, are living with that old understanding. And years ago, we met Temple Grandin. This was back in the 90s when we first were learning this. And Temple said, I can either talk at you or I can look at you, but I can't do both. What do you want? And that was kind of my first aha, was this is not a person's heart. This is how their brain works. And I need to listen to this and I need to adjust. So I said, please don't worry about looking at me. I want to hear what you have to say. So now my next campaign is to help educate photographers and the world about gazing into someone's eyes is not necessarily the only way to do it. And I think it gives us a little bit of a complex that we think as neurotypicals, that we can decide if a person's being honest as to whether or not they directly look at us. Because I want you to know, as a principal, I've had some really incredible students look me in the eye and tell me something that I knew factually was untrue. But if I were only measuring that by the way they looked me in the eye, I would get it wrong.
And I think this concept of misconceptions and myths that need to be busted is one of our big barriers. But another big barrier that I think exists is I really think people have a hard time understanding autism. Like you and I can talk about it's a processing difference, it's a social communication difference, it impacts executive functioning, sometimes sensory processing, and we say these words. But then when you talk to people, every person, not just autistic, has been coached at some point in their life to modify their behavior or their communication to be successful. Like every person I know, whether that's in school or work at some point was coached in some way that if you present differently, if you speak differently, if you make more eye contact, if you hold your arms a certain way, there's, data that shows that those people tend to be more successful. And so one of the things I think is challenging, and a lot of the great neurodiversity at work and some of the books, they're very great, but they still have this individualistic perspective that if the individual learns the expectations of the business and can modify a few things, they will be more successful at work. But that's counterintuitive because the things you're saying would need to be changed are the disability. And so how do you help people get over that? Yes, you can modify your communication style and ways of thinking, but this is a real disability. This is not something that maybe our children, as they grow into adults, do improve in some ways, but it's never going away. You can't train it out of them. I know some of these programs, well-intended, they have weeks of training to see if they can be, I don't like the phrase, less autistic. That's not what they say, but that's what they're trying to do. So how do you help? Because I think this is a huge barrier for the individual to the workplace. They can't always self-advocate. They may not even know what to ask that employer. So I think that's a big barrier. You?
Agreed. I'd like to step back in time for just a minute. I'm a boomer. I'm a baby boomer. And when I was in school, our teachers were taught, and actually I was taught this in my education classes as well, that left-handers are disadvantaged and life will be difficult for left-handers. And so we need to fix that left-handedness. And I sat as a child in elementary classrooms with loving teachers who had been taught in their education courses to go to whatever lengths you need to go to get that left hand put away and have that student write or cut or measure and use their right hand. So I have sat and shook when a teacher slapped a left-handed student that was using scissors. I have watched a teacher tie a left hand behind a student's back in order to correct that behavior, all well-meaning, all well-intended. But you need to understand this was the belief that this was a problem. It was going to ruin their lives. We live in a right-handed world. We're going to make you right-handed. In 2023, we now know through all of the brain research and MRIs and understandings, handedness is neurological. You are born handed, left or right for some people. They can switch between. And there's actually nothing wrong with being left-handed. And now our society has adjusted and accommodated and made all kinds of considerations that there are left-handed can openers. There are left-handed golf clubs, left-handed wine bottle openers. I mean, there's left-handed everything. And it's not a problem. It is an acceptable piece of society. Scissors, and again, the list goes on. There's a store in San Francisco that is for left-handers, and they have hundreds of items. You can go online and find them. And in our schools, we're not slapping and tying behind their back and doing these just archaic behaviors that in my lifetime happened to children that were left-handed from teachers that were well-meaning. They were trying to prepare them for life because we now know that that is neurological. My heart is that we will get to a place in society where we understand that there are different kinds of brains and that we make adjustments and flexibilities and understandings that there are different ways of doing things and there's no one right way. We have respect for that diversity. It is, to me, neurodiversity is, it's the next place that we have got to go to. We've got to educate. We've got to understand.
And so on that note, we know that there's parents listening, there's leaders listening, there's other advocates that are probably cheering in the background. What are some strategies? You have a parent, you have an individual, they're struggling to find employment. They hear what you're saying, but the doors they're knocking on, they're not there. What are your recommendations for them?
My big tagline is, what am I missing? And so I would like to encourage all of your listeners to ask that question. I would like to encourage leaders, coworkers, parents. I'd like to encourage grandparents that feel like there are certain ways of doing things, family members that what worked for them would surely work for this loving niece or nephew or grandchild. I would like to ask them, what am I missing? Because our brains do work differently. And in so doing, we have to consider the fact that there's not just one right way to do things. That's my number one big takeaway. When we can be flexible, that response. And I love asking the individual that I have in question, my son, my coworker, the person that I'm coaching. What am I missing here? Something's not quite right. Let them offer me some insights that I would have never dreamed existed because they saw life so differently. But that is the brilliance of our brains, is the fact that we don't all experience things the same.
As we come to the end of our session together today, and I'm looking forward to many more, what are really your hopes in terms of the short-term future of breaking barriers and really pushing the realization of neurodiversity at work?
One of my deepest desires is that in organizations, specifically leaders, professionals, colleagues, that they will take the time to ask that question, what am I missing? And even more than that, to believe the person when they share their perception. I think sometimes our neurotypical minds get locked into one way of seeing things. And if we are truly going to respect diversity in thinking, neurodiversity, that we have to step back and give time to say, wow, I had never considered that, because we don't consider it because our brains are typical. But for those whose wheels turn differently, sometimes more slowly, as with my coachee at AUI, but sometimes with many others, when we stop and we listen, we find solutions that never crossed our paths. And so I think that's probably my heart, is that we would take time and open-mindedness to consider that there's a wealth of untapped resources that we have to slow down and hear and consider. Our pace of our society moves so quickly. And when we step back, we get such wonderful responses. Nothing that we ever dreamed of thinking.
I have to say that my experience too is just opened my eyes to this whole other world and way of being. And I think as you've been talking today, I love that question about what am I missing? Because it opens up the conversation that you're saying is so critical to really understand where the person is and where you might be able to meet them. And then just being able to accept that somebody's reality and experience of the world is so different from your own. And I think as parents, we get there quicker because we're invested in the development of our children. And when we see things aren't working, as any parent, you do what you have to do to find your child's success. And I think our bridge is getting leaders who may not have that exposure to at least consider the validity of those experiences and the value those individuals bring if you can meet them where they are. Are there any final thoughts that you have that you would like to share with the audience today? I think that your way of posing that question is a great takeaway for everybody, that if they have never asked that question before, what am I missing? Because normally we ask the question, what can I do for you? Or what do you need? And maybe that individual doesn't know that answer. But if you can explore the problem together, maybe you can come up with a solution.
I do have one final thought. And this is from Sean. He wrote this in his journal, and it was a very dark and difficult time for our family. Sean said, "Sometimes I wish I was a caterpillar. I could close myself off from the world and still grow into something beautiful."
Thank you for sharing that with us, Joy, because he is beautiful. And you are an amazing mom and a leader to bring his story and your story to the rest of the world. I can't thank you enough for your time today and sharing all of your insights. And you are on LinkedIn. Everybody can find you, Joy Carol Young. And I just encourage all of you. Joy is the most welcoming and resourceful human being I think I've ever met. She cheers on everyone in the space. So I encourage you to reach out and connect with her if you're ever seeking additional information. As for myself.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank AudioWorks Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.